All right, hello, and welcome to one of the first new videos of 2021 for our exam preparation period. I'm recording this on the 10th of September, so you're probably preparing for your last SAC or doing it very soon, but soon you'll be moving on to revision. There's a massive exam revision playlist from last year where we look at all the poorly answered VCE exam questions from the study design. We also look at a whole bunch of skill-based stuff, so I highly recommend checking it out. I'm going to start doing a couple of new videos based on requests that people send me for things I haven't done before or just new things that pop up. So today we're going to be focusing on how to respond to stimulus material when you get given it in an exam. A lot of the time, unless you're doing CPAP practice acts where they give you like a business management style case study, you don't get a lot of stimulus material other than the occasional graph. Sometimes in the end of your exam, VCAR likes to give you a quote or things to go with other stuff that you then have to kind of use in your answer. And we're going to look at kind of the degree you have to use it and how that informs the way that you answer. So we're going to look a little bit into the fact that VCAR likes to include quotes or charts in questions which historically students struggle to include in their answers. This is aimed to give you some strategies to maximize your marks when you're provided with stimulus materials. What they will be this year is likely to be some graphs. Maybe there's going to be some key quotes from the government about certain things they're trying to do. It used to be really focused on, like in 2017, we had a focus on jobs and growth. Also, there was a focus at some point about achieving surplus. But we'll look at some of the ones from the past, how they were used, how they need to be incorporated into answers, or how they didn't need to be incorporated. So we'll get straight into question 1 from the 2020 VCAR exam. So I had this quote from Philip Lowe, the Governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia, saying, "The lower cash rate has put downward pressure on the exchange rate, which is supporting activity across a range of industries." So a lot in that quote, but then it led into question 1A, describe how a lower cash rate in Australia puts downward pressure on the value of the exchange rate and how this might support activity across a range of industries. This is a really easy one to start off with because everything relevant from the quote is in the question. So even without the quote, you're probably going to be including things from that quote in your answer to that question. So when we look at this, what do you need to talk about? Well, you've got to talk about how a lower cash rate puts downward pressure on the value of the exchange rate. So that's talking about the fact that when the cash rate is lower, foreign investors take their investments out of Australian financial institutions in search of greater yield elsewhere, and therefore that creates a greater supply of Australian dollars on the foreign exchange market and depreciates the Australian dollar. Now you've got to get into how that might support activity across a range of industries. What a lot of people struggled with in this question is that range of industries. And one thing that's going to be focused on when we look at VCAR's recommendations is that mining and tourism were the key focuses here. I guess a lot of students wouldn't have gone for tourism in 2020, but when this was written, this was obviously written before we got into the real serious parts of the pandemic, or Pandy for short, as we've been calling it. Talking about those range of industries and how that depreciated Australian dollar will benefit them. So if you look at what VCAR said, a low cash rate implemented by the RBA decreases the return on investment in Australia. As a result, it is likely that overseas investors will be less attracted to financial return on offer in Australia, leading to less capital inflow into Australia. At the same time, relatively lower cash rates in Australia means it's likely Australians will seek relatively high rate of return on investment by investing in overseas markets, increasing capital outflow. This combined effect of less Australian dollars demanded in the foreign exchange market and more AUD supplied leads to a fall in the value of the currency. A depreciation of the exchange rate helps improve Australia's ability to compete in the global market for goods and services, thus boosting our international competitiveness of our exports as they become relatively cheaper. This offers benefits to the incomes of the export industry, such as mining and tourism. At the same time, the falling value of the AUD makes imports relatively more expensive, thus decreasing the demand for imports, making it more likely that Australians will buy local instead of overseas. This helps import competing industries such as manufacturing, as Australians are more likely to buy locally as they're relatively cheaper from overseas. So this really, the important part here is this is really highlighting that range of industries. And as you can see from the stimulus, they didn't exactly have to quote anything, but it was important they kind of addressed all parts of that quote. So range of industries ends up being incredibly important there. But it's not like English where you have to directly pull things from that quote. It's just you need to like really address every part of it in your answer. You could quote parts of it if you wanted, but this is showing a high mark example from VCAR where they didn't really have to quote anything specifically, but they addressed all parts of that quote. Then something that you almost always guarantee to need to do, having a graph, in this case housing prices from 2019 Referring to the graph above, describe the trend in the growth of Australia's housing prices over the last 2 years. So we've talked about this in previous videos, but having it really specifically here, whenever you get given a chart, you need to use the data. And what that means is specifically point out where the data is at the start, at the end, any important things along the way. You need to use that data. And one of the main ways people stuffed up in this question is that it's describing the trend in growth of Australia's housing prices. If you've been reading my blog, I have a blog about how people stuff up questions when there's the word growth in it, because they don't talk about growth correctly. What a lot of students lost marks for is they talked about in this middle area when house prices are increasing between 3% and 11%. They talked about when it fell from, say, 11% to 3%, that house prices fell. But no, in that time, they only grew by 3% rather than 11%. They still grew, but they didn't grow as much. It's only at this bottom part where they fell by, say, -7%, that house prices fell. So it needs to be negative for it to be negative growth or shrinking. So really, really important there. If you have the word growth, you'll be able to talk about that. But knowing how to use all that data in that graph is going to be really important. So what VCAR has said is that for students to get full marks in this question, they need to describe the trend in growth over the specified period, so the past 2 years. Important thing to look out for is that past 2 years. Sometimes that will give you way more data and you need to ignore all of it except the last 2 years. And refer to some of the data in the graph to provide evidence to support their description. So is it increasing or decreasing, and using data to back that up? Or is it growing more or less? While most students were able to be awarded the full 2 marks, some had difficulty in demonstrating the distinction between changes in the rate of growth and the change in house prices. So some people were just saying house prices going up and down, but it was about the growth in house prices, which is the important part. So looking out for words like growth. So a specific thing there, and using the stimulus, knowing that it's growth that you're looking at, not just prices. If you look at 4B from the 2019 exam, this one has a bit bigger of a quote. And what's interesting about this quote is this quote came straight under question 4, had the quote, and then it was like A, B, C, D, etc. So technically that quote was to inform all of that umbrella of questions. So growth in Australia's major trading partners is expected to slow slightly over the next couple of years. Further, US-China tariff measures came into effect in the last few months, and trade restrictions appear to be weighing on export orders for some countries. The possibility of trade protectionism escalating further presents a significant downside risk of global growth from the RBA in November 2018. So the first question in this was just a distinguished question, didn't really require much from the quote. But then when we get into question B, explain one way in which a decline in the rate of economic growth of Australia's major trading partners may influence either Australia's balance of payments on current account or the value of the Australian dollar. So you go really either way here, but in this, what's going to be kind of important is kind of informing your answer by this information. So we're expecting growth of major trading partners to fall as US-China tariff measures come into effect. So because the US has placed more tariffs on China, China's growth is expected to slow down, which will negatively impact Australia. And you could really use that in your answer. Talking about China being Australia's major trading partner, if there's more tariffs being put on China from the USA, that's likely to decrease their growth overall, and therefore that's going to negatively impact Australia's demand for exports. And you can then tie that into either the balance of current account or the value of the Australian dollar, because either way, it's going to either decrease the balance of trade or it is going to decrease the demand for the Australian dollar on the foreign exchange market and therefore lead to a depreciation of the Australian dollar. So really, really important there that you can tie in some of that and the importance of that and be able to link it to logically to theory. So if we look at what VCAR said there, it was expected that students would include the following points or similar in response to this question. So when there's a decline in the rate of economic growth of Australia's major trading partners, it's likely that this will lead to less demand for Australia's exports of goods and services. And less demand for exports means that either, and it's exactly what we talked about, so the balance of payments in current account is negatively impacted as there's less income for exports while maintaining the same level of income out as Australia pays for its imports. Therefore, it's likely that the balance of payments on current account will see an increase in the size of its deficit or a reduction in the size of its surplus. Whereas if you look at the Australian dollar, it will depreciate because there's less demand for exports, which means less demand for Australian dollars on the foreign exchange market. So don't say too much about linking in with that, but that linking with China part and China's growth slowing would be so important for talking about Australia overall. And let's look at our last one. So in 2017, they had an obsession with jobs and growth. The government talked about it the whole year, and it was in, I swear, about 40% of the exam questions. So Treasurer Scott Morrison stated in his 2016-17 budget speech, Treasurer at the time, Prime Minister now, how far he's come, a plan for jobs and growth. Describe the 2016 performance of the Australian economy in terms of jobs and growth. A question this vague really threw students, because what it's really asking for, it's asking about full employment, and it's asking about strong, sustainable economic growth. And what it's really asking is saying, how have we been going at achieving those goals? So using data about them. And so there's a lot to do there in terms of just a describe question, because you're gonna have to talk about like where they were, where they are now, how they're trending, and how that means we're going in terms of jobs and growth. And so using the words jobs and growth is pretty important there in terms of using the stimulus overall. So then what VCAA had is that students were asked to describe the 2016-17 performance of the Australian economy in terms of jobs and growth. The phrase jobs and growth was used as a mantra by the government. This is basically just repeating what I said before, but students need to recognize that this question was asking about the performance of the economy and their ability to create employment and achieve the goal of full employment, and increase economic growth and achieve the macroeconomic goal of economic growth. So you need to link the fact that jobs and growth meant those things and then use data to justify that. And a lot of students either vaguely just talked about jobs and growth, like creating jobs through budgetary policy, but didn't really link it to those goals, and therefore they couldn't access all of the marks. So sometimes it's really important. The questions aren't going to ask you everything. You need to be able to interpret what it's actually wanting from you, which can be tricky. And that's pretty much it. So thank you for watching this. If this was helpful to you, or there are things that would benefit you more, feel free to let me know. I'm more than happy to help out in any way that you can. If you have any other requests, send them through, and I'm happy to make them between now and the exam in November, as VCAA is unlikely to move it. If you're watching this before the 30th of September and the 1st of October, feel free to sign up to my revision lecture on the website, www.therunningeconomy.com, where you also find a whole bunch of other blogs and resources to help you prepare for the end of your exam. On that, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.